Trusting in God is one of the most joyful and one of the most hard things about the Christian life. We have been given all of these promises about who God is and what He'll do and how much He loves us, and yet the reality in our lives, sometimes, momentarily, seems to say something different. We recognize in the Word of God that He wants a relationship with us, that He pursues us, that He cares for you and for me, that He blesses us, and yet momentarily, sometimes, it seems that there are difficult things happening. It seems that there are situations that we can't quite control. It seems that God is somehow in the background and we're waiting for Him. And we're called then to trust God. We're called to put our trust in Him. Think about the people in Isaiah's day. When God had promised them His deliverer that we talked about all during December, way back in the book of Genesis, He had laid out who this deliverer would be and what He would do. And said this deliverer would come through Adam, and would come through Seth, and would come through Noah, and would come through Shem, would be descended from the line of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And then we find out in the last little part of Genesis that He would be born of the tribe of Judah, that He would be king, that all the nations would come to Him, that He would restore and reconcile His people to Himself, that He would undo the work of Satan, that He would undo the work of the tempter in the garden who drew people away from God, and instead He would draw people back towards God. And He would return us to the paradise that was lost. And this is who God promised. A deliverer would come. And this deliverer is echoed through the next 4 books of the Bible, through Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. And this promise hangs over even the structure of the first 5 books of the Bible. And God makes this promise and says there's going to be a deliverer, and then there's nothing for a good long while. Israel is freed from oppression and taken out of the land of Egypt. They enter into the promised land, and then there's difficulty, and then there's struggling, and then there's division, and then there's sin. And it seems like, God, where are you? Where are you in this situation? God, I thought that you had this wonderful plan for my life, but God, what are you doing? And this question hangs over the entire history of the nation of Israel. It hangs over the people for the entire time that they're without a king. And then they have King David come along, and God makes His promise to him and says, the future deliverer is going to come from your line, is going to be a king from your line. And so we're watching over David's family, and we're watching David's family in the Old Testament sin and chase after other gods and ruin their lives and the lives of other people and enjoy oppression and privilege and division and power. And it doesn't seem like this is part of God's promise. And so as a follower of God in Isaiah's day, you would be looking at everything around you and you would be wondering, God, where are you? God, where are you? God, what are you doing? Well, this is the situation that Isaiah is speaking into in our text this morning in the beginning of chapter 7. See, what happened is God had noticed everything that was happening in the nation of Judah. He noticed that people were walking away from what they should be doing. He noticed that things didn't seem right. And so in the first 5 chapters of Isaiah, God pronounces judgment. And He announces a prophecy of restoration that said there would be judgment, but God would come along and He would bring His people to Himself. And He would restore the nation of Israel. And then in chapter 6, Isaiah has this vision of God on His throne. Okay? Imagine how comforting that would have been. In the middle of all of your difficulties, in the middle of hardships, in the middle of things not going well, in the middle of all of this, imagine how hard it would be to trust God. In the middle of your lives, our lives, when things don't seem to be lining up, imagine how difficult it would be then to trust in God. And in the middle of everything that's going on, Isaiah has this vision in chapter 6 of God on His throne and in control, and it says about the Lord, the whole earth is full of your glory, right? Imagine having that revelation right when you need it, of knowing that God is in control and He is on His throne. And some of you, by the way, this is part of your story. Some of you have that where you've gone through difficulty, you've gone through hard times, you've gone through things not lining up, and you prayed to God hard and repeatedly and for a long time, and then suddenly God made Himself clear to you during a hard time of difficulty and hardship, and God reveals Himself to us. And so Isaiah sees God on the throne and he says, Lord, I can't do this. I can't look upon you. I'm a sinful man. And an angel takes a coal from the altar, the place of sacrifice, right? Where sin is atoned for. And Isaiah had said, he had said, I'm a man of unclean lips in the midst of a people of unclean lips. I'm sinful, Lord. And the angel took the coal and touched his lips with it, redeemed him, said that God is in control, and because God is in control, Isaiah is saved. He's reconciled. He's brought back to God. And now in chapter 7, this is the very first thing that follows that amazing experience that Isaiah had with God. And so he's called to trust in God. And the first part of trusting God is to watch for God, to watch for what God is doing. And so in chapter 7, we read about how the wicked king Ahaz faced a crisis. The northern kingdom of Israel, which was not serving the Lord, and the kingdom of Syria had teamed up to make war against Judah and try to take over the land. Their plan was to kill King Ahaz of Judah and install their own king on David's throne. And so Isaiah went to Ahaz to tell him that the Lord would deliver the people of Judah, but King Ahaz didn't seem to care. And then Isaiah offered a sign, any sign, to back up his prediction. But Ahaz wouldn't name a sign that he would be willing to listen to. And so the Lord announces his own sign. So read with me Isaiah chapter 7, starting in verse 10. Again the Lord spoke to Ahaz. Ask a sign of the Lord your God. Let it be as deep as Sheol or as high as heaven. But Ahaz said, I will not ask, and I will not put the Lord to the test. And sometimes we cover up our disobedience with religious sounding language. That's what Ahaz did. Verse 13. And he said, Hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you to weary men that you weary my God also? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. You shall call his name Emmanuel. The virgin will give birth to a son. Remember the first thing that we learned about the promised deliverer in Genesis at the beginning of Advent last year, all that time ago, was that he would be the seed of the woman, the offspring of the woman. And we thought there's something weird in the language there. Repeatedly throughout the Old Testament, there's these little turns of phrase, these little turns of language that are meant to make you sit up and go, something doesn't compute here. And there's something strange about the way that this is being put. Well, that language about the seed in Genesis bears fruit. That's a little horticultural joke. That language about the seed of the woman in Genesis bears fruit in Isaiah, where he develops it further. He says the virgin will give birth to a child. And the word here for virgin always means virgin when it's being used. It's always of an unmarried woman who hasn't ever been married. That would be the implication. And so we trace the seed of the woman down to this. This promise that God gives, he says this is going to be the sign. Okay? This is going to be the sign that there's going to be something unusual that happens. And so when we trust for God, we watch for God. We watch for God to do things to fulfill his promises. And so he says there's a sign that you can watch, that you can look out for. And the next sign that Isaiah can watch out for is this child's name. I'm going to try this out. This child's name will be Emmanuel. Now, there's nothing unusual about a name. There's nothing unusual about someone being called something. There's actually lots of people today who are named Emmanuel. So why is this a sign? Well, it's a sign because Emmanuel means God with us. It's a sign because for the first time in all the Bible up to this point, there'd been little foreshadowings, little things that don't quite add up, little things that didn't seem quite to come into a clear focus, and Isaiah brings them into a clear focus here. He says this person will be God with us. He will be Emmanuel. And so we see here the word for God is El, E-E-L. So this promised figure is El with us. In Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6, this is developed even further. The coming king is called Mighty God. So there's El with us, God with us. There's Mighty El, Mighty God. In Jeremiah chapter 23, verse 5, this coming person is described as God again. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, and he will reign as king and deal wisely, and shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. In his day, Judah will be saved, and Israel will dwell securely. And this is the name by which he will be called, the Lord our righteousness. So God our righteousness. So he is God with us. He is the mighty God. He is God our righteousness. He is God born in human flesh. He is God but come to rescue us. He is God, but he'll be born as a baby to a virgin. Who does that sound like in all the history of the world? It sounds like Jesus. And the third sign that they're meant to watch out for, to know that God is truthful and trustworthy, is there's a partial fulfillment in Isaiah's own day. In chapter 8, there's a son that's born to him that's named Meher-Shalal-Hashbaz. You just say it fast and confident, no one really knows. And this is Isaiah's son, and it seems in chapter 8 like this is the fulfillment of the prophecy that Isaiah just made in chapter 7. And in part it is. It's a partial fulfillment. But then down in chapter 8 verse 16, it shows that this is just a partial fulfillment, that there's going to be a fuller reality later on. In chapter 8 verse 16, it says, "Bind up the testimony, seal the teaching among my disciples." That means put it away for a while. It's going to take a while for this to come true. "I will wait for the Lord, who is hiding his face from the house of Jacob, and I will hope in him." Verse 18, "Behold, I and the children," including Meher-Shalal-Hashbaz, "I and the children whom the Lord has given me are signs and portents in Israel from the Lord of hosts who dwells on Mount Zion." So these signs are given, but then a regular baby is born to healthy parents, and that doesn't seem to be very miraculous. But then Isaiah says, we're just a sign, there's something else coming. He says, "I and the children whom the Lord has given me are signs." I thought that was the fulfillment. No, it's a sign of something else to come. There's the first child, there's the partial fulfillment child, but this is pointing to another child who is to come. And so, yeah, there's a fulfillment here, yes, but God says there's something more. He's pointing to something further than this partial fulfillment. And so we have a little sign of God showing his faithfulness in Isaiah's day. It's that third sign, though. It's that little bit fulfillment, but not all of it, not just yet. See, in seminary, when we go through classes, this is called prophetic excess. There's something that God predicts, and it's fulfilled a little bit, but then there's a little bit of excess. There's a little bit left over to that prediction, to that prophecy, that isn't quite fulfilled the first time. And it's there because the first fulfillment points towards a second. There's a child who's to be born, and before he knows how to eat the curds and honey, before he knows the good and evil, before he's old enough to do this or that, those kings that were coming against Ahaz, they'll be defeated. That's the partial fulfillment. The further on fulfillment comes in Isaiah chapter 9. Even after Isaiah's son is born, he is continuing to predict a future child. So we watch for God, we wait for the signs that he gives, and the second step is we wait for God. So we watch for God and then we wait for God. That's how we trust in him. So this promise is for a later time, and it's something involving Galilee, Zebulun and Naphtali, the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. And these two territories, Zebulun and Naphtali, over here, that's where the towns of Nazareth and Capernaum are located. There's Nazareth in the territory of Zebulun, where Jesus was raised, and Capernaum in the territory of Naphtali, where Jesus made his home base and did his ministry around the Sea of Galilee. It's also called Galilee of the nations, over here. But this prediction was given before Israel went into exile, before it was filled with different people from nations all around. And so it even predicts that something bad is going to happen, but that God is going to work through it. And so even though this is a king who comes from the line of David, even though this deliverer is someone who would sit on his throne in Jerusalem, there's something about Galilee that's important to look at. And we should wait for, this text is saying, we should wait for a later time. We should wait for a child to be born who has these special characteristics. We should wait for him to do something very special involving the land of Galilee. And we should wait for the birth of the child. In verse 6, "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given." We should wait for him to be king. The government shall be upon his shoulder. And his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God. All of these are names for God, by the way. His name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace or ruler of peace. In the Bible, prince is a general term for a ruler over an area. And even beyond that, he's going to have a kingdom that's never going to end. It'll have no end in space or time. I'll show you, of the increase of his government and of peace, there will be no end. What does that mean? How far is this kingdom going to expand? It's going to go everywhere. Everything in heaven and on earth will bow the knee before Jesus one day. And how long is it going to last? Verse 7. On the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and uphold it with justice and righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. Forevermore. He will have an eternal kingdom with no borders, because there is no boundary mark line to mark off where his kingdom ends. And we should wait for that. We should wait to see what God will do at that point. God gives Isaiah some things to notice and look for, some signs, and then he tells him to wait, bind up the testimony. This is going to take a while. And when it happens, here's where to look. When it happens, here's what it's going to look like. And so as we trust in God, we should remember that part of trusting in God is to watch for him to do what he's promised. Keep your eyes open. See where God is working in your life. See where God is working in your family. See where God is working and fulfilling his promises. And lots of tiny little circumstances are starting to happen to lead towards something specific. And you can see sometimes God's hand moving, and you can go, I don't know exactly where he's going, but I can see him at work. And this helps us to trust in God. And so as we watch for what he's doing now, we're called to wait for what he will do. And that leads us to step 3, which is we should hope in God. So this child that's predicted in chapter 7, that continues to have more detail added on in chapter 9, even after Isaiah's son is already born. It's added to again in chapter 11. Here's what it says. We'll read Isaiah chapter 11, verses 1 to 9. Okay. There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse. So this is a descendant of David. And a branch from his roots shall bear fruit, and the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord, and his delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. He shall not judge by what his eyes see, or decide disputes by what his ears hear, but with righteousness he shall judge the poor, and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. He shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall strike down the wicked. Righteousness shall be the belt of his waist, and faithfulness the belt of his loins. The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the young goat. Has this happened yet? No, so this is the future. This is something that we can hope in and expect. The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, verse 6, and the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, and the calf and the lion and the fattened calf together, and a little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze, their young shall lie down together. The lion shall eat straw like an ox. Now there's an unusual sight. Verse 8, the nursing child shall play over the hole of the cobra, and the weaned child shall put his hand on the adder's den, and they shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. And then, here's a strange phrase. Notice there's these tiny things throughout the Old Testament that if you're reading through quick, you miss, and if you're reading through very carefully and very slowly, it makes you sit up and notice. Read Isaiah chapter 11, verse 10 with me. In that day, the root of Jesse, who shall stand as a signal for the peoples, of him shall the nations inquire, and his resting place shall be glorious. Okay. So Jesus has 2 titles here. In chapter 11, verse 1, he is the shoot from the stump of Jesse. He's a descendant of David. And what does it say in verse 10? It says he's the root. Okay, he's the descendant, he's the shoot, and he's the source. He's the one who gave Jesse life. He's the one who gave life to David and his offspring. He's the one who is the source and the reason for it all. He's the shoot and the root. He is born from the line of David, but his beginnings go way back to eternity. That's what Micah 5:2 says as well. There's this developing thing throughout the Old Testament. There's a little bit of detail that's given, just enough to make you wait, just enough to make you wonder, just enough to make you say, God, what are you doing? And so you watch. so that the people of the Old Testament, they watched, and then over time it gets developed, it gets added onto. God makes the picture just a little more clear. He does it in Isaiah chapters 7 to 11, this unfolding, developing prediction of the child. He does it also, as we'll find out in a couple of weeks, in chapters 40 to 55, this unfolding, developing prediction of the servant, where he says something completely unexpected about who Jesus is. But to know more about that, you'll have to come the next 2 weeks. This shoot from the stump of Jesse, he will bring forth a messianic paradise. He will bring us back to Eden. He will cure all the wrongs of the world. He will make this a place where there is no sickness, no tears, no sorrow anymore, for the old has gone and the new has come. And this root of Jesse, the source of David's whole existence, the one who comes, but the one who already is, he will govern the nations. He will rule in glory. He will reunite Israel. A commentator named Alec Motyer, who wrote this book over here, it's a devotional through the whole book of Isaiah. It's called Isaiah by the Day. He writes, one of the most striking features of this remarkable passage is its dual title of the coming king as both the shoot and the root of Jesse. The reference to Jesse indicates that the shoot is not just another king in David's line, but rather another David. In the book of Kings, successive kings were assessed by comparison with their father David, but no king is called David or son of Jesse. Among the kings, David alone was the son of Jesse. And so the unexpected reference to Jesse here has tremendous force. When Jesse produces a shoot, it must be David. But to call the expected king the root of Jesse is altogether another matter, for it means that Jesse sprang from him. He is the root support and the origin of the family through which the Messiah would be born. It's a very good devotional, by the way. I'd encourage you to pick it up if you're currently looking for something to help you through your scripture reading. He also has one on the book of Psalms, though I still want to recommend Ian Valancourt's book, Treasuring the Psalms, first, if you're going through Psalms. But God's developing this picture. And then what does Jesus say about himself in one of the very last verses of the entire Bible? In Revelation chapter 22, verse 16, here's how Jesus identifies himself. He follows up on this passage. He says, "This is me." He says, this is a quote, "I, Jesus, have sent my angel to testify to you about these things for the churches. I am the root and the descendant of David. I am the bright morning star." And so, what's Isaiah's response? Isaiah's response in chapter 12, verse 2 is to say this. There's this response to the developing picture of the child, and he says in chapter 12, verse 2, he says, "Behold, God is my salvation. I will trust and I will not be afraid, for the Lord is my strength and my song, and he has become my salvation." By the way, saying that God is our salvation, that's another title of Jesus. You know how we translate it? By saying the name Jesus. That's the meaning of his name. He is God with us. He is the mighty God. He is God our righteousness. And he is God who saves. That's who Jesus is. That's who Isaiah points us towards. And so as we trust in God, here's what we find out. Who is coming? Who is the rescuer? Who's being predicted? Who, in the middle of all of the difficulties in Isaiah's day, in the midst of all of the long period of time that it seemed to be since God first predicted the future deliverer, here's the picture of this figure that Isaiah draws so far. 1, he's going to be from the line of David. 2, he's going to be born of a virgin. 3, he's going to have significant activity around Galilee, around the area of Nazareth and Capernaum and the Sea of Galilee. 4, he claims titles that are reserved for God. 5, he'll be both a shoot from Jesse and the root of Jesse. And 6, he'll rule a kingdom without end and return humanity to paradise. Was this book written after Jesus' time? Was it written to back up the claims about who Jesus was? Is this an invention of Christians just inventing evidence for Jesus? No, it's not. We have copies of the entire book of Isaiah that are older than the time of Jesus is. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's one scroll that's 400 years before the time of Jesus. It has these exact passages in it, worded just this way. We could translate the same thing over again, and we would find this incredible picture of what, to my mind, is just an undeniable picture of Jesus. If you knew Hebrew, you could read the same thing word for word, accurate from a copy of Isaiah that is hundreds of years older than the birth of Jesus. Because God is trustworthy. God can be trusted in. We can wait for God. We can watch for God. We can hope in God. Because just like I talked about partial fulfillment, it's still partial. There's still some things in here that haven't happened yet. But we've been given examples of God fulfilling his promises progressively, and so we know that this time in the future that Isaiah describes is for us. That this time in the future is going to happen. That God will do these things. We can look out in society right now, and we can look out in the world, we can see people fighting each other. We can see protests and counter-protests. We can see people arguing online or on social media. We can see families divided over political and cultural issues. We can see all kinds of things, and we can wonder, God, when is it going to stop? And he promises that it will. He promises that he will deliver. He promises that he is on his throne. He promises that he can be trusted in. And so the message of Isaiah chapters 7 to 12 is that we can trust God, that we can watch for him, that we can wait for him, that we can hope in him. And that's something we can think about as we enter into this new year, that we can celebrate and remember and call to mind and look forward to, once again, his coming. Let me pray.